You work at a prison?
I have worked at prisons. I've worked at jails. I'm actually everything from state to local from state to local to federal. So
I had you in the class like maybe a summer ago or 2 summers ago, and you said you worked for the FBI. What did you do for them?
So within the FBI, they have a center called the NCABC, which is the National Center for Assessment of Violent Crime. And in that center, essentially what they do is they do some of the kind of tracking data for different types of crimes. They do demographic tracking data for different types of offenders, what kind of crimes they're committing, those kind of things. So that was more of a research position that I did when I worked with them. And the specific research project that I was working on there is we were looking at a term called bystander apathy. And
did you work with, like a diverse group of people?
Yeah. I think probably more than any other site, and this is probably somewhat anecdotal, but I think it's pretty evident in the literature, is if you go into a prison and a jail, it's predominantly ethnic minorities, okay? There are white people there, and there are and it depends on location too, but you have there's a huge Hispanic population, especially here kind of in Lubbock. So Hispanic population is huge, African American population is huge. And then you kind of throw in a new variable, especially when you jump up to the federal facilities, is you go international as well. And so you can have people that are from Mexico, from, all over, just international, so maybe they don't speak English, so that's a whole nother kind of variable of multiculturalism that you throw into it. You've got gender variables, so whether we're talking about male, female, you've got the idea of like transgender. So if we've got a male that comes into the facility who identifies as female, maybe they haven't had like a surgery to kind of redefine themselves. Where do we put them? Do we put them in a male pod? They're probably going to get sexually abused there, raped, whatever it might be. But then do we put them in a female pod? That might allow them to have more of a predatory status there as well. So diversity-wise, not only looking at ethnicity, but international, religion, gender, all of those things is huge there. And one thing that I like to encourage people to think about is how do people get to prisons or jails? How do you get there? You commit a crime, right? Okay. So some crimes will get you sentenced in different ways. Do you guys know about like the drug sentencing laws?
No.
Okay. So one of the big arguments for why there's a larger majority of ethnic minorities in prisons is because most of the population is drug oriented. Probably, I don't know the exact statistic, you guys could look it up on the Bureau of Justice Statistics because they have it. About 65 to 75% of the crimes are drug related. So trafficking, selling, possession, those kind of things. Well, the big drug is the difference between crack and cocaine. So I can have an ounce of cocaine, I'm going to get sentenced to a year. Someone else is going to have an ounce of crack, they're going to get sentenced to 10 years. It's a 1 to 10 ratio. When you look at the price of drugs, cocaine is a lot more expensive than crack is. You can get your money or you get your hands on crack for a lot less. Crack we find a lot more in lower SES communities, a lot of times with ethnic minorities who are living in those areas. And so a lot of people have argued that the drug sentencing laws are undermined by this kind of, this racism that's really trying to consequence lower SES individuals and incarcerate them over the ones that are higher SES. And there's other variables that play into that you can look at of like, okay, so if I've got a ton of money and mommy and daddy can buy me a really good attorney, probably have a good amount of money if I'm smoking, doing lines of coke versus smoking rocks.
Yeah.
So there's all of these kind of variables that interplay into it, but that's one of the huge arguments is these drug sentencing laws is why we have such a huge population and why there's this huge kind of minority difference. And if you look at, there's been some research on sentencing differences. So if a white person and an African American person commit the same exact crime, juries and judges typically sentence harsher. So there's these sentencing biases as well of individuals. Look at it. Judges are primarily white. It's just the way it is. A lot of times it's the jury of your peers, but if we're not in an area where there's a lot of ethnic diversity, a lot of times the jury's not necessarily going to look like your peers, and they tend to do a lot harsher on sentencing guidelines for ethnic minorities. And so that's, to be fair, also looking at socioeconomic status. It's funny because the same way we project onto people kind of walking down the street, you see somebody, you size them up, you make assumptions like, oh, they've got a lot of money because they've got a nice purse or whatever it is. You size people up and you make assumptions. And it's funny because clients almost always will size you up and they think you're really smart, really rich, have this really fabulous lifestyle. The dynamics between a counselor and a client, whether they're real or not, sometimes it's about the perception. And so if a client perceives me to be this, you know, really rich girl that comes from a really kind of prestigious family in this prestigious area and drives a convertible BMW, they may not think that I don't relate to them as well. Whereas if they really knew kind of what my actual background was, it may not be as different from theirs as they might think it is. And a lot of times they're projecting their stereotypes onto you as well, and those kind of dynamics. And I mean, I sit there in front of my clients and I'm obviously white, they can see that, they can see I'm female. Now they maybe can't see sexual orientation and SES, but they make assumptions about those things. Think of the prison or correctional environment as a culture in and of itself, because it is, it's an environment, and you have to respect the fact that, yeah, they're paranoid because it's not safe to walk across the yard sometimes. You're fine, no one's gonna get shanked. That's not their reality. Prison culture facilitates in this kind of splitting of groups. You know, all of the effeminate males are over here. All of the Hispanic males are over here. The white supremacists are over here. You know, like, you get off into these gangs and they're oftentimes divided by color lines because that's the easiest thing to differentiate on, at least kind of when you're first sizing somebody up. And so you get a lot of that split. So even if I'm white and I go into a prison and I've never been a white supremacist, I've never been in the KKK, okay, am I going to identify with these guys or I'm going to walk the yard by myself? Okay, I'm going to have to split over here just as a pure self-preservation thing. And so there's some kind of culturalization too within the prison environment, just for, okay, this is what I got to do, because if I walk over to, you know, the West Texas Syndicate over here, which is predominantly Hispanic, they're going to look at me and go, because they're not going to trust me.
Do you find that they like treat African Americans different from white people or Hispanics?
Generally, yes, but in any environment, we're talking about medical doctors, accountants, you're always going to have your bad eggs. It's going to happen, you know, inevitably. And I can at least say from experience, I have seen people, correctional officers, treat offenders in general negatively. I don't know that and this is anecdotal obviously, I don't know that I've ever seen anybody make explicitly racial, sexual, religious oriented kind of those type of bigoted comments, but it wouldn't surprise me if it happened, which is probably really sad to say. I'm not naive enough to think that it's not present, but then also being mindful of the fact that it could happen. I don't care who you are. I think if you think that you don't see race or you don't see religion or you don't see sexual orientation, that's risky, because then you're not allowing yourself to evaluate your reactions to people. So I think that's a general issue within the field, is making sure that when we are norming treatment programs, if we are norming measures, is that we're using a really, really diverse sample to make sure that our results can generalize to a lot of different people. And we run into problems because in prisons, that's not typically who we work with. It's some of it, but it's not a majority. And like I said, I don't know the exact statistics, but if you go to, I think it's doj.bgs.gov, it's the Department of Justice, Bureau of Justice Statistics. They've got stuff on there for crime distribution, and you'll see that a vast majority of it's drug. You'll have stuff on there for distribution of racial ethnicity, they'll have age, they have religion, they have gender. It's probably the main stuff they have, but you can find a lot of kind of multicultural statistics on that site for kind of different populations. Any other questions that you guys might have, or things that I didn't address that you wish I would have?
That actually sums up everything that we want to ask you.
Okay. Yeah, and the only caveat I would say to most of the stuff that I provided you just with, like, I mean, that's anecdotal. It's based on my limited experience.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, no problem. Have a good weekend.
I don't know. Did they record over?